Hey everybody, welcome to the latest edition of Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen here with my co-host, Philip Nguyen. Philip, how you doing?
Greetings, doing all right.
Good, I'm glad to hear it. We on Accented Dialogues on Diaspora talk with fabulous guests whose work centers on the Southeast Asian diaspora. Today, our guest is the debut novelist Tracey Lien. She was born and raised in southwestern Sydney, Australia. She earned her MFA at the University of Kansas and was previously a reporter for the Los Angeles Times. She lives in Brooklyn, New York, and All That's Left Unsaid is her first novel. All That's Left Unsaid is set in 1996 in the Sydney suburb of Cabramatta and centers around the brutal murder of the local teenager, Denny. Returning home to Cabramatta for the funeral, Denny's older sister, Ki, learns that the police are stumped by Denny's case. Several people were present at Denny's murder, but each bystander claims to have seen nothing. Ki determines to track down the witnesses herself, and by peeling back the layers of the place that shaped her, Ki confronts the complex traumas weighing on those present the night Denny died. And she finds that the seeds of violence that led to his death were planted well before that fateful night by colonialism, by the war in Vietnam, and by the choices they've all made to survive. Tracey Lien, welcome to Accented Dialogues in Diaspora.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's fabulous to have you here, and I'm a fan of crime novels and thrillers and all that kind of stuff. I like violence, I like despair, I like novels that use the crime genre to explore social and political and historical issues, and all that is true for All That's Left Unsaid. But I don't think I've ever read a crime novel set in the Vietnamese Australian community. And I'd like to ask you, tell us a little bit about just like how you grew up in the Vietnamese Australian community. We haven't really foregrounded the Vietnamese Australian experience on this show before. And I think many of our audience members would love to hear more about what that was like growing up in Vietnamese Australia and what the nature of that community is.
Yeah, I think the Vietnamese Australian experience doesn't get foregrounded anywhere, not even in Australia. And so I've lived in America for nearly 10 years now, and it was the act of moving to the US that got me to reflect more on the place I came from. And, I've lived in the Bay Area, I lived in New York, I lived in Kansas, and I would always look for the equivalent of Cabramatta, which like the closest thing I could find would probably be like the Little Saigon in Southern California or even San Jose. But none of those were quite right because Cabramatta has a really high density. It's very walkable. It's got a really large Chinese Vietnamese population as well. And it's also a product of Australia. And so there were all these qualities about it that I missed. But I also had to reckon with the fact that it experienced the heroin epidemic in the 90s. It was Australia's heroin capital. It was sort of the poster child of why multiculturalism wouldn't work in Australia. So it was just such a complex place where on the one hand, it was home, and on the other, it was this place of, high crime rates and gang violence, and a place that just wasn't really cared for by a lot of people. Absolutely.
And then Philip, I think you had a question for.
Yeah, definitely. Welcome, Tracey, and really glad to have you. So this Vietnamese Australian, or this novel that centers Vietnamese Australian experience, right? Why crime? I mean, you kind of alluded to it, right? But why crime? Why is it in the 90s during this heroin epidemic? How is that related to the Vietnamese Australian, community?
Right. So normally when I get asked a question like this, I'll quote or reference something that Viet has said. And it's not weird because he's not there. And so this is probably going to get a bit weird because I'm probably going to quote you back to you now. And if I get it incorrect, please don't say anything. But there was an interview that I read that you gave a while ago where you said something to the effect of a lot of novels that are historically or politically minded tend to be long on mood and short on entertainment. When, why can't a novel, be entertaining and grapple with those heavier issues. For example, the Sympathizer tackles issues of colonialism and imperialism, and it's a spy novel. And I really took that to heart because in writing this novel, I knew I was going to tackle themes of racism, themes of intergenerational trauma, and I didn't want All That's Left Unsaid to be the kind of novel that people would look at and think of as homework. The kind of book where you should buy it, and you should have it on your shelf, but you have to be in the right mood to get into it. And so I was very cognizant of that. So I thought to myself, what are the types of books that once I start them, I can't put them down? And I read fairly widely, but it's always like the murder mystery. If there's the murder mysteries are what get me. And once I start them, I'll just read through and be done in a day or two. And so I started thinking about what can I borrow from murder mysteries to try to give my novel a propulsive quality. So that's where the crime element came from. And then in terms of my decision to set it in the 90s, Cabramatta did in the 90s experience a real heroin epidemic. It was a time when the city was predominantly people of color, mostly refugees from Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And it was also a time when the police force was 100% white. And there was a lot of indifference there, and in some cases, even racism. So I knew it was an inherently tense period in time and a tense location to tell any story. So sort of just connecting those dots and finding the optimal situation to get the message that I wanted to get across.
Yeah, when I read your novel, I was so intrigued by the focus on the murder and the heroin epidemic and all this kind of stuff, because I grew up in a Vietnamese American refugee community in the 1970s and 1980s in San Jose. And although I don't recall anything about drugs, we were deeply afraid of Vietnamese American gangsters. That we were not afraid of other kinds of criminals, but it was the Vietnamese American young people, usually guys, that we were terrified of, because they in San Jose, California, they invented a whole new crime called the home invasion, which is when they would go to Vietnamese American homes and break in and torture people to try to find where the gold and the money was, because they knew that Vietnamese American people or Vietnamese refugees kept their money at home and not in the bank. And so this was just part of the reality of the community, and it went on for a very long time. And I'm just really fascinated by the fact that apparently something similar was happening in Australia as well among the Vietnamese Australian community. I'm just curious, why you think that was the case? Why was violent crime such a big deal in these refugee communities during this time period? And did you have any problems writing about that? Because I think we're all aware that when we start talking about Asians being gangsters, we feed into some of the stereotypes that non-Asians have about Asian refugees and Asian immigrants. They come to our country, whatever the country is, and they're gonna, out of their Chinatowns and their little Saigons, they're gonna peddle drugs and commit violent crime and all these kinds of things. So that's a real stereotype. But in fact, it was kind of true in some ways. But as a writer coming from the community, I just was wondering, did you feel any anxiety foregrounding that as part of your story?
So to answer the first part of the question, when I was doing my research, I was struck by the fact that there were quotes from police officers at the time talking about how, the home invasion was invented by criminals in Cabramatta, and that prior to the wave of Vietnamese immigrants arriving, the home invasion was not a category of crime in Sydney. And I think a lot of politicians at the time seized on the issue to make the case, look, these people don't assimilate. Here is the case against multiculturalism. It doesn't work. These people come from Vietnam and they just can't make it work. But the more I researched, the more I realized that, well, what do a lot of these refugee communities have in common? They're arriving in predominantly white countries. They have very little social support, very few social services. No one is acknowledging the presence of PTSD. No one is acknowledging how much the parents have to work. And a lot of these young people, when they were interviewed about why they joined gangs, it was never the allure of drugs or violence. It was a sense of community. It was finding people who understood them. And from there, it could be a slippery slope for a lot of people. But the unwillingness to even inquire about that, or to acknowledge that, you know, these young people who were as young as 11 were sort of disenfranchised, marginalized, disillusioned, and no one was intervening at that level. You know, it was much more convenient to just say, look, these are bad people. You know, they don't have the DNA to be Australian. And so that was the first part. And then in terms of depicting sort of the uglier side of Cabramatta, it was incredibly difficult because I was really aware that Cabramatta had rarely been depicted in literature before. Throughout the 90s, it would appear in the media, oftentimes for the wrong reasons. There was a movie that came out in the early 2000s, Little Fish, starring Cate Blanchett and Hugo Weaving, that centered the heroin epidemic, but the characters were white, and it was about a white family struggling through a heroin crisis. So I was aware that, oh, this is going to be a lot of people's first introduction to Cabramatta and to even like Vietnamese Australians. And I was really worried that if I depict them as anything but perfect, will people get mad at me? Will the Vietnamese community get mad at me? And what I realized was, if I depict them as perfect, as angelic, as they're all so hardworking and they're all victims and they all just suffer, that's not accurate. And that in itself is another stereotype that people like can't live up to. And I would be setting the community up to fail. Whereas if I simply tell the truth, and the truth is that, look, there are Vietnamese Australians who are incredible. They're generous, they're kind, they're hardworking. And then there are Vietnamese Australians who are gangsters, who will invade your home, who will rob you at gunpoint. And then there's everything in between. Then that's making the point that we're just like everyone else. And if we're just like everyone else, then please hold us to the standards you hold yourself. Treat us like you treat yourself. And I think that is ultimately the more ethical thing, even though it was really hard in the moment. I was like, oh no, will the Vietnamese people be mad at me? It's like, well, I need to do what I feel is right and to tell what I believe is truthful.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tracey. And I'm almost emboldened to, I'm emboldened to even say that, you know, this diversity of perspectives, narratives kind of fits into what Viet calls narrative plenitude, right? Is that we don't need to feel like we're essentialized by any singular or monolithic story, which I feel like your novel definitely does, right? Across the spectrum of Vietnamese Australian representation. My name is Philip Nguyen. I'm one of the co-hosts for Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, presented by the Diaspora Vietnamese Artist Network. I'm here with my co-host Viet Thanh Nguyen, and we are speaking with Tracey Lien, whose debut novel, All That's Left Unsaid, centers Vietnamese Australian narratives and perspectives. So Tracey, I know that you also have prepared a short excerpt to share with us, if you wouldn't mind reading for us now.
Yes, I'll provide a bit of context. So my novel is told from the point of view of Key, who's the older sister of Denny, the boy who has been murdered. But it alternates with chapters from the point of view of the witnesses. And basically every character is Asian Australian except for one, Sharon Faulkner, who is a white woman, very well-intentioned. And the section I'm going to read is the introduction to her chapter. And what I really love about her is that it sets up that even the most well-intentioned people are capable of causing harm. And based on what I read, you should be able to see like the mess that she might get herself into later. But the thing I also love about Sharon is that she doesn't give up. She keeps trying. So this is from chapter 5 of All That's Left Unsaid. When the first Indo-Chinese refugees arrived in Australia, Sharon Faulkner was a high schooler in Sydney's inner west who had seen Asian people only in photos, on the news, and in World War II textbooks that showed propaganda posters of the Japanese as buck-toothed rats. When the first Indo-Chinese left the Commonwealth migrant hostels equipped with a handful of English phrases, a distaste for porridge, and the newly acquired knowledge that they couldn't digest cow's milk, Sharon Faulkner was on her way to Newcastle to study education with a cohort that was completely middle-class Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And when the first Indo-Chinese refugees settled in Cabramatta, opened the first pho restaurants, established the first Vietnamese grocery stores, Sharon Faulkner accepted a job straight out of university at a high school in Hay, some 725 kilometers from Sydney, town population 1,300. Hay was a comfortable place for Sharon Faulkner to teach. In a place like Hay, teachers were on a first-name basis with parents, and the kids themselves weren't too different from her. They all burned easily in the sun, watched cricket on Boxing Day, and used the term mate in a passive-aggressive manner to signal that they'd run out of patience. But Sharon was a city girl at heart. She wasn't made for Hay's scorching summers or the vast ring of nothing that surrounded the town and stretched for hundreds of kilometers in all directions. The first time she saw a tumbleweed, she ran out of her cottage in pajamas and a pair of flip-flops to follow it, giddy to see where it would go. Sharon spent 3 years in Hay. She took the first transfer available to a metropolitan school in a suburb with a name that she thought sounded Italian. When the first Indo-Chinese refugees, motherless and fatherless, found one another in southwest Sydney, banded together, created their chosen family, them against the world. When they enrolled in high school without understanding a word the teachers said. When the parents who came with babies and toddlers raised them as best as they could, put them in secondhand school uniforms, ordered them to work hard, to be good, to claw back the success and stability that had been torn from them. When a 16-year-old black-haired boy smoked a white powder off a piece of aluminum foil, then passed it to his friend, who passed it to his friend, who passed it to his friend. When the police and politicians decided that a certain ethnic enclave didn't have the DNA to be Australian, and the Prime Minister of the country said Vietnamese sob stories didn't ring his withers, and the friction of fear and hate coalesced in an Italian-sounding suburb of 4 square kilometers, Sharon Faulkner, freshly transferred from Hay, hair bleached golden by the sun, arrived in Cabramatta.
Just gonna golf clap over here. Thank you so much for that, Tracey. Your characters feel like almost eerily real, and like the setting that you articulated for us, it feels like I mean I feel like I'm there, right, in that classroom with Sharon Faulkner. I kind of also want to ask you about like what your research process was like, learning about the Vietnamese Australian community. I mean, I know that you're from there, but what was that process like? And also, is Sharon Faulkner based off of like a real well-intentioned white person trying to help out refugees?
I feel like Sharon Faulkner is a composite of a lot of well-intentioned people. And I see a lot of myself in her as well, because I think of myself as a really well-intentioned person, but I've stepped in it often. And I'm just grateful that people have called me in and, you know, sort of told me like, hey, that's not cool privately, instead of experiencing things the way she had. But in terms of the research, so even though I grew up in Cabramatta, I was not directly exposed to the life of gangsters or to drug dealers. And so I had to do a lot of research, and some of that was ethnographic papers. You know, people were really drawn to Cabramatta at the time because it was like, here is this refugee community that's going through a heroin epidemic. That's worth studying. So going through that, combing through newspapers and newspaper clippings at the time. Part of where I got the inspiration for the nature of the murder was there was this clipping that was like maybe 200 words long. And it was about a community fashion show that was held in Southwest Sydney. 300 people were there. 2 gangs showed up and just had a huge fight where people were like injured and it was a mess. And when the police showed up, they were like, no one will talk. There were 300 people here and they all just claimed they didn't see a thing. So seeing snippets like that helped me definitely like spin up a story. And then conducting interviews was a big part of it as well. You know, getting in touch with people who are former users, former dealers. And even though the book doesn't focus heavily on drug use, you know, I wanted to know things like, how did people sell and buy heroin? You know, or how does someone make the leap from smoking it to injecting it? You know, like just wanting these details that could then enrich the world that I could put these characters in. So definitely like my background in journalism helped a lot in that regard.
You know, by the way, we are here with Dialogues in Diaspora. I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen, your co-host. Along with my other co-host, Philip Nguyen, we are talking today with the debut novelist Tracey Lien, who has just published her first book, All That's Left Unsaid, about crime and family drama and racial tension in the Vietnamese Australian community of the 1990s. I'm curious, Tracey, besides the crime and the drugs and the violence and the fact that this is a murder mystery, part of what your novel is about is this relationship between our protagonist, Guy, who's investigating the murder, unsolved murder of her brother, Denny, Guy and her friend or former friend, Minnie. And, Guy discovers in the course of this investigation that her former friend, Minnie, who she was really, really close to, is now involved with gangs. So there's a dimension of your novel that's very much about friendship, about the relationships between girls and women. I'm wondering why you decided to put that at the center of your novel as well.
Right, I've always been fascinated by the complexity of female relationships. Like, few relationships are ever as intense as what two teenage girls who are best friends go through. Very rarely will you be in a relationship with someone where you love and hate them in equal measure, where you want to compete with them, but you don't want them to compete with you. And it's just incredibly complex. But in exploring this friendship, it gave me a way to show two different paths that people can take in an attempt to thrive. Key sees if she just follows all the rules, if she's a goody two shoes, if she sort of embodies the model minority, she sees that as her way of being taken seriously and treated fairly. And Minnie, very early on, just recognizes that the system is kind of rigged. And she's like, and I don't want to play. I don't like these rules. I think that they are stacked, the odds are stacked against us. I'm not going to play. And I think in a society where white supremacy is part of the foundation, like, there's really no way around it. Like, it's all rigged, regardless of whether you decide to play or not to play, you're in it. And so the point I was trying to make is, like, these girls, these young women have found ways to survive in a way that we all find ways to survive, but they're not thriving. And that's because the odds are stacked against them at the societal level.
So Tracey, I mean, speaking about Australian society and where sort of Vietnamese Australian community members fit in, where would you say your debut novel fits into the broader context of Vietnamese Australian society, identity, literature, or its literary traditions?
Right, so I think that the Australian literary landscape isn't quite as robust as what's available in America. Like, if you go to JFK right now, there are books in the hardcover section, like my novel's there, Tran's Daughters of the New Year is there. You go to LaGuardia, Carolyn Huynh, The Fortunes of Jaded Women has her own little cubicle next to Maggie O'Farrell. So it's feeling really good and healthy in America. Whereas in Australia, I think we're sort of in a catch-up period, where we're seeing like more people of color starting to speak up and starting to tell stories, but it's been slow going. And yeah, I think what's interesting is that if you look at the Australian census data from 2020, 25% of respondents said that they had Asian ancestry. In the major cities like Sydney and Melbourne, that number is closer to 30%. Half of respondents in the country said that at least one parent was not born in Australia. So about a quarter of the people in Australia are Asian, but you wouldn't know that based on the narratives that are exported, the images in the media. Even if you're in Australia, turn on the TV, you wouldn't know. And so even for someone like me, I used to think, well, if our stories were worth telling, surely someone would have done it already. And so it took the distance from Australia and seeing stories being told elsewhere that sort of gave me the courage and the confidence to attempt it myself. And my hope is that, with my novel and with other novels coming out now, hopefully people will feel emboldened to take that step and tell their stories too.
I find that really interesting because, well, number one, I've heard that my surname and Philip's, we're not related, by the way, I don't think, but our surname is Nguyen, which is apparently something like 40% of the Vietnamese people have this surname of Nguyen, which if you remember that there's 90 million people in Vietnam and about 4 million people in the diaspora, the Nguyens themselves constitute their own nation. And in Australia, I've heard that Melbourne, for example, the Nguyen surname in the phone book, if it still exists, is something like the 7th most popular surname or something like that. So we got a lot of us over there, but it's really interesting you're saying that there hasn't been a lot of Vietnamese Australian writing that's been coming out, despite this high population of Vietnamese and Asian Australians. That I'm sure that a lot of it is due to the white supremacy that you talked about and the pressures against Asian Australians speaking out and the identification of Australia with being a white country versus its actual diversity. But is there also internal pressure within the Vietnamese Australian community to, as with the Asian American community, to not go into the realm of literature and writing and the arts, or even in journalism, as you started off with?
Yeah, I think very few parents want their children to undertake like risky career paths. And so for me, even becoming a journalist, that was very risky in my parents' eyes, even though there was a clear track to a job. And when I left the LA Times to go and study at the University of Kansas, my parents were baffled. They were like, but why? And the only answer that seemed to calm them momentarily was, when they checked in and they were like, will it increase your earning potential? And I said, yes, sure. If I have this MFA in fiction writing, it will increase my earning potential. So I think there is like a lot of risk aversion, in Asian communities, in immigrant communities. And I think that's the same in a lot of places.
So Tracey, your novel, have you debuted it in, you're in New York now, and then you've kind of been across the United States. Have you done a reading or a reception in a stateside or in Australia with the Vietnamese American diasporic Vietnamese community?
So the book actually launched in Australia first, but I was in America when that happened. So in terms of like a physical book launch, that took place in Brooklyn. But the book has been, like, to my delight, doing really well in Australia. It was a top 10 bestseller in the fiction category. And so I'm definitely feeling the love and support, even though I'm not there right now.
Well, that's fantastic news. And if you're just joining us now, I am Viet Thanh Nguyen, co-host of Accented Dialogues in the Diaspora with my co-host Philip Nguyen. We're talking with the debut novelist Tracey Lien about her first novel, All That's Left Unsaid, set in the Vietnamese Australian community. So it's a top 10 bestseller in Australia, Tracey. I'm hoping that there are all these people in Australia, Asian Australians, Vietnamese Australians, who are like, oh my God, we have someone who's written and published a novel and it's a bestseller, which solves all the problems that you were talking about earlier, like your parents, like, oh, what are you going to do with an MFA? And, why are you going to be a writer? And you say, oh, mom and dad, I published a novel and it's a bestseller. And people understand that dimension of things. Do you think that, number one, how has your family responded to the success of your novel? And have people been reaching out to you? Like other Vietnamese Australians or Asian Australians who are saying, oh, wow, thank you for publishing this novel, and it gives me hope that I can do my own creative work?
Yeah, I've been hearing from a lot of Asian Australians, not in terms of sort of feeling emboldened to write their own stories, but I think for them, they feel seen. And that's something that I was really hoping to be able to do. So to hear that, it's really rewarding. And then in terms of my parents' response, so I think the moment when my mum sounded the most proud, it wasn't when I told her I'd sold the novel. It wasn't during publication day. It wasn't even when the book was ranking well in Australia. It was when my book had a window display at Dymocks in Sydney. And Dymocks is sort of like a Barnes and Noble. And I had pressured her and my dad to go see it. I was like, it's only up for a week, please go see it. And they went to see it. And then she calls me and recounts this to me. And she said, this Vietnamese woman and her daughter were walking by and they stopped and did a double take. And the woman says to her daughter, Lien is a Vietnamese last name. I think a Vietnamese person wrote that. And then they continued walking and did not buy the book. But my mom was so excited. And I think it's that classic, like, well, if you did something and another Vietnamese person didn't acknowledge it, did it even happen? And now for her, it's like, yes, it happened. So she was thrilled and I was happy for her and happy for myself as well.
Oh my gosh, proud moments of Vietnamese pride, parental pride. I think that's so incredibly beautiful, especially when in the second and subsequent generations, we do inherit a lot of the trauma that they hold, right, and the baggage that they carry with them from the old country. And you write about that in All That's Left Unsaid, Tracey. But I also want to ask you, do you feel like there is inherited joy that we in the next generation also feel?
Absolutely. I think sometimes there's like an inherited sense of humor. I've been told that I have a very similar sense of humor to my mother, which is really askew. It's basically like someone will be telling a serious story and we will both just interject with little jokes. And we can't help ourselves. And it's like, I definitely got that from her. But also, I think, you know, in terms of sometimes the different love languages, right? Like our parents express their love for us in a way that, you know, is in line with their love language. And for us, having grown up in Australia or America, we might desire a more Western type of love language. But we still feel it. I think we still understand why they've made these sacrifices for us, even if, you know, they're not necessarily saying, I love you, I'm proud of you, even if they're not apologizing to us for things that they've done. I think deep down, like a lot of us can sense when they are kind of apologetic, or we can sense their love for us. And I think that because that comes through, that is something that we can enjoy and celebrate as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tracey, for joining Viet and I tonight on Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. It was so wonderful to hear about you, about Cabra Mata and the Vietnamese Australian community that you so fondly write about, and in all of its complexities in All That's Left Unsaid.
Thank you so much for having me.